Socialism takes aim at the environment. Can we save the planet without fundamentally changing society?
Yo, it's now law.
New legislation raises taxes while providing major subsidies for green ventures. Will that slow economic growth? And is that a good thing?
Mother Earth gets angry from time to time, and this legislation will help us address all of that.
Hello, I'm Brett Baer. Despite all their differences, the free market economist Adam Smith and communist Karl Marx agreed on one big idea: economic growth is good. But today, even that has come under attack. Over the last 3 decades, free trade and global capitalism have lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty. But many socialists now argue the price of all that growth to the health of the planet and society at large has been just too high. And as with so many other problems, socialism is ready with a solution: less reliance on the free market, greater regulation, and more government control. In 1850, when Alfred Lord Tennyson described nature as red in tooth and claw, he summed up attitudes toward the natural world that had prevailed for centuries. Nature was seen as wild, capricious, and cruel, and beyond the control of man. Wilderness was all around us. There was lots of it. And the idea of taming nature was both arrogant and quixotic.
When we view how people looked at nature in the past, they saw it as a scary place. For example, in the Bible, the word wilderness was used, and wilderness was not a nice term. It was basically, if you go there, bad things will happen to you. You might be attacked by wolves, you might fall down a crevice. It would be terrible. And so people were actually afraid of nature. It was not a place that people went for recreation and fun. It was scary.
But by the mid-19th century, society's relationship with nature was changing. Industrialization was altering the landscape, while mechanization was transforming agriculture and commerce. The steamship shrunk the world. The cotton gin modernized the factory. The railroad revolutionized transportation. In Europe and America, an urban middle class was starting to emerge, with an entirely new commodity at their disposal: leisure time. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes had famously described the life of man in his natural state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Progress allowed for a different vision: an idealized world where man lived not against nature, but in nature.
In the 19th century, there was a middle class. They basically had the leisure time to go out in nature and have picnics and have their servants carry them about and basically make nature a pleasant place. There were not forests left filled with wolves and that kind of thing. So basically, the kind of nature they were encountering was very different than had been previously encountered by people living in previous centuries.
In the arts, these changes ushered in a movement called Romanticism. To painters like Caspar David Friedrich and J.M.W. Turner, and writers like Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley, nature was not scary at all, but a source of spiritual renewal. And when they set off into the natural world, it was not a journey of exploration, but of personal discovery. In a sense, the Romantics were the first eco-tourists.
It's an interesting way to think about the Romantics as the preliminary eco-tourists of the 19th century, as it were. They did think of nature as a place of rejuvenation, and partially because the population had been growing in England quite a bit. The Industrial Revolution had taken off, and you had people, more and more people, crowding into cities to take advantage of the opportunities that the Industrial Revolution provided. And so a certain leisure class found this offensive. They didn't like the press of people in the modern cities like London and Manchester and so forth. So they would go for fresh air and rejuvenation to their country places. And so it was obviously something that only fairly well-off people could do.
In 1844, Samuel Morse transmitted the first long-distance message on his newly invented device, the telegraph. Over wires hastily strung between the U.S. Capitol and the Baltimore train station, Morse tapped out the question, "What hath God wrought?" That same year, the struggling writer Karl Marx first met Friedrich Engels in a Paris cafe. Marx and Engels were witnessing firsthand the economic transformation anticipated by Morse, a world where rapid advances in technology would improve productivity, changing the workplace and the world. Like the free market economists he would come to critique, Marx believed economic growth was good.
Both Adam Smith and Karl Marx were in favor of growth. And what's interesting about it is up until the 18th century, economic growth was not something that most people had encountered. And as a matter of fact, average per capita income in Europe in the year zero was basically $400 per capita. And it had only gotten up to about $1,750 to $800. So most people didn't encounter economic growth. So what you have then are people like Adam Smith and Karl Marx living in an era where you could actually see prosperity slowly but surely accumulating and growing faster than ever before. And this made them more optimistic about the prospects of, if you will, of human history and of human flourishing.
But Marx and Engels were not immune to the idea that economic growth had an environmental cost. In 1876, Engels wrote, "Let us not flatter ourselves on account of our human victories over nature. Each victory, it is true, in the first place, brings about the results we expect, but in the second and third places, it has quite different, unforeseen effects, which only too often cancel the first. When the Italians of the Alps used up the pine forests on the southern slopes, they had no inkling that by doing so, they were cutting at the roots of the dairy industry in their region. They had still less inkling that they were thereby depriving their mountain springs of water for the greater part of the year. Thus, at every step, we are reminded that we by no means rule over nature, but that we belong to nature and exist in its midst." The first stirrings of what would become the modern environmental movement emerged in the 1890s. Frederick Jackson Turner had declared the American frontier closed, and progressives sought first to preserve the wilderness that remained. Photographers like Carlton Watkins and later Ansel Adams captured images of what was soon labeled the vanishing West. President Theodore Roosevelt, an avid outdoorsman famous for his love of hunting and camping, called for further protection of dwindling forest land, stating, "We are prone to speak of the resources of this country as inexhaustible. This is not so." John Muir, a Scottish-born naturalist and writer, founded the Sierra Club in 1892 and successfully advocated for what would become today's national park system.
John Muir was basically the first person in the United States to think of himself as a conservationist, that what he wanted to do was conserve nature as opposed to use it and set it aside for a place of recreation and rejuvenation for people. In a certain way, he harks back to the Romantics, the British Romantics of the 19th century. And so he founded the Sierra Club for the purpose of preserving, not just conserving, but preserving nature, not using forests for timber, but for places for people to go, again, to restore themselves over time. And he was definitely behind the creation of the first national parks in the world, which of course the first one was Yellowstone.
Progressives in America, like their socialist counterparts in Europe, saw unleashed capitalism as a powerful force, able to dominate society and spoil the environment. Theodore Roosevelt wrote in 1913 that there was once a time in history when the limitation of governmental power meant increasing liberty for the people. In the present day, the limitation of governmental power, of governmental action, means the enslavement of the people by the great corporations. While a portion of nature had to be preserved, the rest needed to be managed.
The 19th century, early 20th century progressives, people like Teddy Roosevelt, basically believed that the free markets, if you will, profit-making corporations, were actually a danger to the environment. They also created problems like pollution and poverty and so forth. And so they believed that government should come in and use scientific technical management to solve the problems. They viewed natural resources like forests and seas and so forth as resources for economic growth, but which had to be managed by enlightened government officials, if you will. Of course, being guided by the scientists who would know everything. So the progressives were actually people who believed in economic growth, and they just thought that their theories about how to do it, centralized, top-down, scientific control, would be better than allowing the plundering by profit-making corporations of the forest. But they also were people who believed in growth as well. They're very different from today's progressives.
By the 1960s, a richer, more prosperous America began to rethink its relationship with the natural world, and increasingly put environmentalism in a global context. Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1968. The book jacket warned, "While you are reading these words, 5 people, mostly children, have died of starvation, and 40 more babies have been born." According to Ehrlich, the consequences of unfettered economic growth were both imminent and terrible for the planet as a whole.
Population Bomb was the runaway bestseller, millions and millions of copies sold. Paul Ehrlich is a butterfly entomologist at Stanford University, but he published this book in 1968 called The Population Bomb, in which he famously said, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, and despite any crash programs that might be embarked upon now.
Would you welcome Dr. Paul Ehrlich?
Ehrlich's book made him an instant celebrity. He argued that to avert environmental catastrophe in the future, governments would have to take drastic measures now.
Now, if the U.S. population started to decline slowly, if we got our death rate a little bit above our birth rate, held it there for a couple hundred years, the fact that we were moving back towards 150 or 100 billion people wouldn't scare me a bit. It would mean that everybody's lives would get better in the long run because there would be more of everything to go around. There's a finite pie. The more mice you have nibbling at it, the smaller every mouse's share.
Well, later in my life reporting, I actually interviewed him when I was working at Forbes magazine and called him up. It was about 1990, thereabouts, and said, "Paul, you said hundreds of millions were going to die in the 1970s, and that didn't happen." He goes, "Well, yeah, I got my timing wrong, Ron." I go, "Really? So when are the famines going to happen?" "Well, they're going to happen between 2000 and 2010. This is what he told me in 1990. The man has never been right.
In 1972, another study, this one bolstered by what its authors called state-of-the-art computer modeling, predicted an even greater environmental catastrophe as capitalism drained the planet of its vital resources.
From a very large number of computer runs, making various assumptions, adopting various maxima and minima, there is in fact a general forecast of a breakdown of world society in the first decades of the next century.
When you examine the socialist argument for environmentalism, it is always based very much on the extreme scenarios. It is based around an alarmist idea that if we don't do this, then you will die or your children will die. This is obviously an appeal to the emotions of the most extreme sort.
By the mid-1970s, economic growth, long regarded by economists on the left and right as a goal worth striving for, was increasingly identified as an existential problem. To a population bomb and a world running out of resources, doomsayers soon added the specter of global warming. Whatever the scientific merits of each environmental threat, the answer from socialists was the same: more government control, more central planning.
Again, it's this idea that government knows best, that government is going to tell us and tell our companies what to do. The best face of this is corporatism, is the government telling companies what to do. That did not work in Mussolini's Italy. I don't know why it would work in the United States of America. And the worst part of it is just out and out coercion, government coercion of the individual. And it has a perfect record in only one thing, in failing. It has never baked a single loaf of bread. It only produces breadlines. It produces gulags. It produces the coercion, the suppression of the individual. This is what we risk here in this society if we buy into this stuff and we don't open our eyes.
As the 21st century began, the watchword for environmentalism became sustainability.
A sustainable economy requires a system in which production is democratically planned and controlled by well-informed people. The environment can be sustained by collective stewardship. We call such a system democratic socialism. The Democratic Socialists of America.
The sustainability movement, of course, has many parts and people believe different things, but on the whole, it is anti-progress. It views itself as trying to make sure that we don't use up our resources to prevent future generations from having access to the same sorts of things. To that end, it's willing to forego the notion that our ability to invent our way out of scarce resources matters at all. It's about conserving rather than creating.
Sustainability, according to socialists, can only be achieved when a ruling elite makes informed decisions for the rest of humanity. Individuals, if left to themselves, simply make bad, short-term decisions.
Thinking in those long-term consequences doesn't come naturally to human beings, says the progressive. Therefore, we need to intervene against the willfulness of the individual and guide people to a better understanding of where they should be. Now, ideally, you convert the individual if you're progressive and get people who are willing and ready to say, all right, I sacrifice my freedom because you know best. So the progressive regime is partly a matter of people saying we know best, but they're also trying to get the public to say, yes, indeed, you do know best. You're in charge.
Yeah, thank you all for being here today on this very important moment.
The Green New Deal is the culmination of an almost century-long effort to remake society in the name of saving the environment. The language is familiar, and the solutions offered predictable.
Today marks the dawn of a new era of climate action. When we look back today, this will be the moment that we will be able to say that the political tide has turned on the rising seas. We are reclaiming our leadership on the most important issue facing humankind. This is the new climate democracy, of the people, by the people, for the planet.
There's nothing inherently socialist about a transition to clean energy. If you look at what happened with American emissions between 2000 and today, they have significantly reduced, and none of that was because of central planning. It's because of technological breakthrough. What the Green New Deal, however, is a forced and rapid transition to supposedly cleaner energy that the market would not adopt on its own. There is no way that the market would look at huge amounts of wind farms and solar panels and say, yes, we will take that, thank you very much, without incentives. Now, the Green New Deal actually recognizes that because this transition will be forced and rapid, it is going to be extremely disruptive to the economy. So that's why the Green New Deal brings in all these other socialist ideas, which are meant to compensate for all the economic damage that the rapid transition will impose.
Today is the day that we truly embark on a comprehensive agenda of economic, social, and racial justice in the United States of America. That's what this agenda is all about. Because climate change...
The Green New Deal agenda goes far beyond protecting the environment. As Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's former chief of staff, Shoykat Chakrabarti, admitted to the Washington Post. The interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all, adding, do you guys think of it as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing.
For the first time ever, we have a plan to tackle some of the most urgent crises of our time.
The Green New Deal.
Environmentalism has become a kind of Trojan horse in which the socialists can get inside the city walls. That's very clear if you read the Green New Deal, because it implies such drastic changes in American economic life that they could only be achieved by a massive expansion of the role of the state.
The Green New Deal calls for achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2030.
Guaranteeing everyone a good job. And
think of the mandate in the Green New Deal radically to alter the housing stock of the United States.
That means upgrading every building and mode of transportation in this country.
And upgrading our entire power grid to achieve maximal energy efficiency.
The more I read of the Green New Deal, the more I thought it was like some parody of a return to the economics of Stalin's 5-year plans or Mao's Great Leap Forward.
It is a call to redefine politics and establish a new social contract for America.
In line.
So I renamed it in one of my articles, the Green Leap Forward, because it seemed to me a kind of green, eco-friendly version of Mao's disastrous attempt at forced industrialization in China in the 1950s.
Marx thought that the contradictions of capitalism, the labor contradictions of capitalism, would lead to its collapse. Modern environmentalists, modern ideological environmentalists, believe that the environmental contradictions are going to be what brings about capitalist collapse. Finally, climate change has given us a reason to destroy capitalism. Capitalism is going to collapse, and when it does, that would be great.
Some go even further, advocating for what they call degrowth for the world economy. To them, the ultimate solution to climate change requires an even more radical step. Economic growth must not just be redirected or slowed, it must be reversed.
The degrowth movement is a slice of ideological environmentalism that argues that the main problem with for saving the planet, humanity, is that we're consuming too much population growth, etc. And what we really have to do is use less and less resources over time. Some people are arguing we should go back to agrarian villages in upstate New York, that kind of thing. When you listen to people who are advocating degrowth, they're always talking about what you need to get to, how few resources and how you should organize your life and that kind of thing. They never talk about the coercion that it would take to force people to move out of cities, to give up the internet, to give up their cars. They never talk about that. They assume that people, or pretend to assume that people will be happy to go live essentially in poverty again. And that's just not true. And in fact, if you do try to literally go for degrowth, you would have to use coercion of top-down, severe limits on human beings' freedom. And they don't talk about it that way, but it is absolutely implied by the degrowth program.
According to many socialists, saving the planet will take much more than just reducing pollution and can only be accomplished by a total reordering of society. That requires central planners armed with science, an approach that goes all the way back to the progressive era. But fixing the environment is just one item on today's socialist agenda. Join me for the conclusion of our series as we look at how some of our most contentious political debates over race, gender, and the teaching of American history are now framed by socialist ideas. That's next time on the Unauthorized History of Socialism, Volume 2.